significant probability to actually fuse. And it actually falls effectively almost to zero for lower temperatures as well, too.
So there's some nice equation that gets you to 50 million degrees, or like you said, practically speaking, 100 million.
So it's a really simple equation. It's the ideal gas law, basically, almost. So in the end, you've got a certain number of these fusion particles in the plasma state. They're in the plasma state. There's a certain number of particles. And if the confinement is perfect, if you put in a certain content of energy, then basically, eventually, they come up in a temperature, and they go up to high temperature. This turns out to be, by the way, extraordinarily small amounts of energy. And you go, what? It's like I'm getting something to like 100 million degrees. That's going to take the biggest flame burner that I've ever seen. No. And the reason for this is it goes back to the energy content of this. So yeah, you have to get it to high average energy, but there's very, very few particles.
This is low density. How do you get it to be low density in a reactor? Is this
so? The way that you do this is primarily, again, this is not exactly true in all kinds of fusion, but in the primary one that we work on, magnetic fusion, this is all happening in a hard vacuum. So it's like it's happening in outer space. So basically, you've gotten rid of all the other particles except for these specialized fuel
add
particles.
Them one at a time.
No, actually, it's even easier than that. You connect a gas valve, and you basically leak gas into it
in a controlled fashion.
Yeah.
Wow, this is beautiful.
It's a gas cylinder.
How do you get it from hitting the walls?
Yeah. So now you've touched on the other necessary requirements. So it turns out it's not just temperature that's required. You must also confine it. So what does this mean, confine it?
And there's two types of confinement, as you mentioned. You mentioned the magnetic one.
Magnetic one, and there's the one called inertial as well, too. But the general principle actually has nothing to do with, in particular, with what the technology is that you use to confine it. It's because this goes back to the fact that the requirement in this is high temperature and thermal content. So it's like building a fire. Right? And what this means is that when you release the energy into this or apply heat to this, if it just instantly leaks out, it can never get hot, right? So you're familiar with this, is like if you've got something that you're trying to apply heat to, but you're just throwing the heat away very quickly. This is why we insulate homes, by the way, and things like this, right? It's like you don't want the heat that's coming into this room to just immediately leave, because you'll just start consuming infinite amounts of heat to try to keep it hot. So in the end, this is one of the requirements, and it actually has a name. We call it the energy confinement time. So this means if you release a certain amount of energy into this fuel, kind of how long you sit there and you look at your watch, how long does it take for this energy to like leave the system? So you could imagine that in this room that, these heaters are putting energy into the air in this room, and you waited for a day, would all the heat have gone to outside if I open up the windows? That's energy confinement time. Okay, so it's the same concept as that. So this is an important one. So all fusion must have confinement. There's another more esoteric reason for this, which is that people often confuse temperature and energy. So what do I mean by that? So this is literally a temperature, which means that it is a system in which all the particles, every particle, has high kinetic energy and is actually in a fully relaxed state, namely that entropy has been maximized. That gets a little bit more technical, but this means that basically it is a thermal system. So it's like the air in this room, it's like the water, it's the water in this. These all have temperatures, which means that there's a distribution of those energies because the particles have collided so much that it's there. So this is distinguished from having high energy particles, like what we have in like particle accelerators like CERN and so forth. Those are high kinetic energy, but it's not a temperature, so it actually doesn't count as confinement. So we go through all of those. You have temperature, and then the other requirement, not too surprising, is actually that there has to be enough density of the fuel.
Enough, but not too much.
Enough, but not too much, yes. And so in the end, the way that there's a fancy name for it, it's called the Lawson criterion, because it was formulated by scientists in the United Kingdom about 1956 or 1957. And this was essentially the realization of, this is what it's going to take, regardless of the confinement method. This is the basic, what it is actually power balance. It just says, there's a certain amount of heat coming in, which is coming from the fusion reaction itself, because the fusion reaction heats the fuel. versus how fast you would lose it. And it basically is summarized by those 3 parameters, which is fairly simple. So temperature, and the reason we say 100 million degrees is because almost always for this kind of fusion, deuterium-tritium fusion, the minimum in the density and the confinement time product is at about 100 million. So you almost always design your device around that minimum, and then you try to get it contained well enough, and you try to get enough density. So, so that temperature thing sounds crazy, right? That's what we've actually achieved in the laboratory. Like our experiment here at MIT, when it ran at its optimum configuration, it was at 100 million degrees. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't actually the product of the density and the confinement time wasn't sufficient that we were at a place that we were getting high net energy gain, but it was making fusion reactions. So this is the sequence that you go through. Make a plasma, then you get it hot enough. And when you get it hot enough, the fusion reactions start happening so rapidly that it's overcoming the rate at which it's leaking heat to the outside world. And at some point, it just becomes like a star, like a sun. And our own sun and a star doesn't have anything plugged into it. It's just keeping itself hot through its own fusion reactions. In the end, that's really close to what a fusion power plant would look like.
What does it visually look like? Does it look like you said, like purple plasma?
Yeah, actually, it's invisible to the eye because it's so hot that it's basically emitting light in frequencies that we can't detect. It's invisible. In fact, light goes through it. Visible light goes through it so easy that if you were to look at it, what you would see in our own particular configuration, what we make is in the end is a donut-shaped. It's a vacuum vessel to keep the air out of it. And when you turn on the plasma, it gets so hot that most of it just disappears in the visible spectrum. Mm-hmm. You can't see anything. And there's very, very cold plasma, which is between 10 and 100,000 degrees, which is out in the very periphery of it, which is so the very cold plasma is allowed to interact with has to interact with something eventually at the boundary of the vacuum vessel. And this kind of makes a little halo around it, and it glows this beautiful purple light, basically. And that's what we can sense in the human spectrum. Yeah.
I remember reading on a subreddit called Shower Thoughts, which people should check out. It's just fascinating philosophical ideas that strike you while you're in the shower. And one of them was, it's lucky that fire, when it burns, communicates that it's hot using visible light. Yeah. Otherwise, humans would be screwed. Yeah. I don't know if there's a deep, profound truth to that, but nevertheless, I did find it on Shower Thoughts subreddit.
Actually, I do have this goes off on a bit of. You're right. This is actually, it's interesting because as a scientist, you also think about evolutionary functions and how we got, why do we have the senses that we do?
Yeah.